You are standing in a corridor made of stone. The walls are thick, perhaps 8 feet through in places, and the cold that lives inside them is not the kind of cold that arrives with winter and leaves with spring. It is older than that. It is the kind of cold that has settled into the mineral heart of the rock itself, that has been gathering slowly for centuries, and it will still be here long after you are gone. This is the Tower of London, and somewhere inside it, in a small room with a window that looks out onto a grey sky and a stretch of river the colour of pewter, a young woman is sitting, very still. She is 20 years old. She is a princess, though that word has meant different things at different points in her short life, and not all of them have been kind. She does not know, sitting here, whether she will leave this place alive. She does not know that she will one day become one of the most formidable monarchs England has ever produced. All she knows right now is the cold and the waiting and the particular quality of silence that belongs to a place where people are brought to disappear. Before we go any further into this story, before we settle in alongside this young woman and trace the long, improbable arc of her life, take a moment, if you like, to leave a comment and share where you are right now and what time it is. There is something quietly pleasant about that, about knowing that someone is listening to this same story in a kitchen in Glasgow at midnight, and someone else is lying in the dark in a bedroom in Ontario at 7 in the evening, and someone else is on a train somewhere in the south of Japan, watching rain slide across the glass. We are all in different rooms, in different hours, in different weathers, drifting through the same corridor of stone. So leave a note if you feel like it. And now, let us go back to the beginning. The story of Elizabeth Tudor does not start with Elizabeth. It starts, as so many English stories of this period do, with her father. Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509 as a young man of 17, tall and golden-haired, and by most accounts radiantly confident, in the way that only a person who has never been seriously contradicted can be. He was athletic, he was literate, he composed music and wrote poetry, and hunted with an energy that exhausted the men around him. He was also, beneath all of that, deeply anxious about one thing, and that one thing would shape the course of English history for the next century. He needed a son. He needed a male heir. The Tudor dynasty was young, only one generation old when Henry took the crown, and it rested on uncertain foundations. His father, Henry VII, had won the throne on a battlefield, and the memory of civil war, the long, exhausting, blood-soaked Wars of the Roses, was still close enough to taste. A dynasty without a clear male heir was a dynasty inviting challenge, inviting faction, inviting the return of chaos. And so the question of who would bear Henry a son became the central obsession of his reign, and the engine that drove everything that followed. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was a Spanish princess, dignified and devout, and she gave him a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. But she did not give him a living son. There were pregnancies, several of them, and at least one boy who was born and died within weeks. The years passed. Catherine aged. Henry grew restless, then frustrated, then something darker than frustrated. By the late 1520s, he had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, and that the only path to a son, and therefore to the security of his kingdom, was annulment. When the Pope refused to grant it, Henry broke with Rome entirely, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and set in motion a religious revolution that would echo through centuries. All of this, all of it, because he wanted a boy. And it was into this storm that Anne Boleyn stepped, or was pulled, or, more accurately, navigated with a combination of intelligence, ambition, and spectacularly bad luck. Anne was not the soft, yielding type of woman that the court was accustomed to seeing beside the king. She was sharp. She was witty. She had been educated in France and carried herself with a sophistication that stood out in the English court. She was dark-haired and dark-eyed in an age that preferred blondes, and there was something about her that Henry found not merely attractive, but consuming. He pursued her for years. She held him off, insisting on marriage, refusing to become simply another mistress, to be enjoyed and discarded. It was a strategy that worked brilliantly, right up until the moment it did not. Henry married Anne in January of 1533, secretly, while the annulment of his marriage to Catherine was still being finalised. Anne was already pregnant. The court astrologers and physicians assured the king it would be a boy. Preparations were made for the christening of a prince. The official announcements were drafted with the word prince already written in, and on the 7th of September, 1533, in the palace at Greenwich, Anne Boleyn gave birth to a girl. This was Elizabeth. Try to hold in your mind for a moment what that arrival meant. The entire machinery of the English Reformation, the break with Rome, the upheaval of centuries of religious tradition, the political ruptures with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, had been set in motion so that Henry could have a son. And here, instead, was a daughter. A healthy, red-haired daughter, but a daughter nonetheless. Henry did not attend her christening. The celebrations were muted. The word prince on the announcements was hastily amended, an S squeezed in to make it princess. And if you want a single image to capture the quality of Elizabeth's welcome into the world, it is that. A title altered at the last moment. A space made for her that was never quite the right shape. For a brief time, things were well enough. Elizabeth was given her own household at Hatfield, a grand estate in Hertfordshire, with servants and attendants, and all the trappings of a royal infant. She was the heir to the throne, at least for the moment. Anne was still queen. There was still time for a son. But the window was closing, and Henry's patience, which had never been abundant, was running out. Anne had another pregnancy possibly two, but no living son emerged. The marriage that had reshaped the religious landscape of Europe was beginning to look like a miscalculation, and Henry was not a man who enjoyed feeling that he had miscalculated. What happened next happened with a swiftness that is still chilling to contemplate, even across the distance of nearly 5 centuries. In the spring of 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, assembled by Thomas Cromwell and others who had their own reasons for wanting Anne removed. She was taken to the Tower of London, the same tower where Elizabeth would one day sit in her own cold room, and tried before a court that had already decided its verdict. On the 19th of May, 1536, she was executed by a French swordsman on Tower Green. She was approximately 35 years old. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months. There is no record of Elizabeth's reaction, because she was too young to have one that anyone thought worth recording. She was at Hatfield, in the care of her governess, Lady Bryan. And it is Lady Bryan's letters that give us a glimpse of the child's circumstances in the weeks that followed. They are practical, almost plaintive letters, asking for guidance. The Queen is dead. The Princess is no longer a princess. Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate by Act of Parliament, stripped of her place in the succession. Lady Bryan did not know what Elizabeth's status was now, or what she was supposed to be called, or even what clothing the child should be given. She wrote that Elizabeth was growing fast and had almost nothing to wear. The household had not been told what to do. There was a small girl in a large house, and no one was entirely sure what she was. This is something worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy, when we know the ending of a story, to rush past the uncertainty of its beginning. Elizabeth Tudor, at not quite 3 years old, was functionally orphaned. Her mother was dead. Her father had moved on. He married Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's execution. 11 days. And when Jane produced the longed-for son, Edward, in October of 1537, whatever remaining interest Henry had in his second daughter diminished further. Elizabeth was not abandoned in any dramatic sense. She was housed, fed, educated. But she was also, in the eyes of the law and the court, a bastard, an inconvenience, a reminder of a marriage that the king preferred to forget. She grew up in the countryside, mostly at Hatfield and at Ashridge, another estate in Hertfordshire. Her household was shared for a time with her half-sister Mary, who was 17 years older and who had her own deep well of grief and resentment, having been displaced and declared illegitimate herself when Anne Boleyn had become queen. The relationship between the two half-sisters was complicated, as it would remain for the rest of their lives. They were bound together by blood, and by the strange shared experience of being daughters whom their father had, at various points, decided were not daughters at all. But they were also separated by religion, by temperament, and by the simple fact that Mary remembered her mother and the life that had been taken from her. And some part of her could never quite look at Elizabeth without seeing Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth's childhood, then, was quiet, but not peaceful. There is a difference. Quiet means that nothing dramatic was happening on the surface, that the days had a routine of lessons and meals and walks through the grounds of country estates, that the seasons turned and the girl grew taller and learned to read and write and speak with a precision that would later become one of her most effective tools. But beneath that quiet, there was always the awareness of danger. She was too close to the throne to be ignored, and too far from favour to be protected. Her position depended entirely on the mood and health of a father who had already demonstrated, in the most visceral way imaginable, that the people closest to him were the people most at risk. Henry VIII died in January of 1547, when Elizabeth was 13. By then, she had been restored to the line of succession, though not legitimised, a fine and characteristically Tudor distinction. She could inherit the throne, but she was still officially a bastard. Her half-brother Edward, 9 years old, became king, and Elizabeth entered a new phase of her life that was, if anything, more dangerous than the one that had come before. She was placed in the household of Henry's sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, who had been genuinely kind to Elizabeth during the last years of Henry's reign. Catherine was intelligent and warm, and she had provided something that Elizabeth had rarely experienced: the sustained attention of a maternal figure. But Catherine, now a widow and free to follow her own heart for what may have been the first time in her life, quickly married Thomas Seymour, the brother of the Lord Protector, and a man of considerable charm and almost no judgment. Seymour was ambitious, reckless, and he seemed to develop an unsettling interest in the teenage Elizabeth. There are accounts, recorded later, during the investigation that followed Seymour's downfall, of early morning visits to Elizabeth's bedchamber, of tickling and roughhousing that Catherine Parr initially participated in, and then, growing uneasy, put a stop to. Elizabeth was sent away from the household. She was 14. The details of what exactly happened between Seymour and Elizabeth are impossible to know with certainty. What is clear is that the episode marked her. When Seymour was later arrested and charged with treason for various schemes, including an alleged plan to marry Elizabeth and seize power through her, Elizabeth was interrogated. She was 15 years old, and she was questioned repeatedly by men who were trying to implicate her in a conspiracy that could have cost her her life. And she gave them nothing. She was careful, composed, and, by the accounts of the men who questioned her, remarkably self-possessed for someone so young. She admitted to nothing that could be used against her. She expressed shock and dismay at appropriate moments. She wept when it seemed useful to weep. Seymour was executed. Elizabeth survived. This is the first time we see clearly the quality that would define her for the rest of her life. Not courage exactly, though she had that. Not intelligence exactly, though she had that too. It was something more specific. It was the ability to understand, in the very marrow of her being, that words could kill. That a careless sentence, or an unguarded expression, or a letter written in a moment of trust, could be the instrument of your destruction. She learned this not from books, but from life, from the experience of being a girl in a world where powerful men disposed of women who became inconvenient. Her mother's head had been cut from her body. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, another young woman accused of sexual indiscretion, had met the same end when Elizabeth was 8. Seymour, who had touched her, and perhaps frightened her, and perhaps done worse, had been executed in part because of his association with her. The lesson was everywhere, and it was always the same. Proximity to power was proximity to death, and the only defense was control. Control of your words, your face, your letters, your affections, the very rhythm of your breathing. The years under Edward's reign passed. Elizabeth lived quietly, studied prodigiously, and stayed as far from controversy as the strange gravity of her position would allow. Edward was a sickly boy, fervent in his Protestantism, and his reign was dominated by the men who governed in his name. When he died in 1553, at the age of 15, the succession crisis that everyone had been dreading arrived. There was a brief, doomed attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, a scheme engineered by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, but it collapsed within days, and Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's elder half-sister, became queen. Mary was 37, devoutly Catholic, and she carried within her a lifetime of bitterness and loss. She had watched her mother be cast aside. She had been declared illegitimate. She had been forced to deny her own faith during Edward's Protestant reign. Now, at last, she had the power she believed was rightfully hers, and she intended to use it to return England to the Catholic Church. The burnings began. Protestants who refused to recant were executed, scores of them, and Mary earned the name that history has never let her shed: Bloody Mary. It is not an entirely fair name. Other monarchs killed more people for less reason, but the burnings were public, they were visceral, and they left a mark on the English consciousness that centuries have not erased. For Elizabeth, Mary's reign was the most dangerous period of her life. She was Protestant, or at least she was perceived to be. She was the heir to the throne, the person who would benefit most from Mary's death. And there were plots, real ones and imagined ones, that swirled around her name, whether she encouraged them or not. In early 1554, Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion against Mary, partly in opposition to Mary's planned marriage to Philip II of Spain. The rebellion failed. Wyatt was captured and executed, and Elizabeth, who may or may not have known about the plot in advance, was summoned to London. She came slowly, claiming illness, which may have been real, or may have been a way of buying time. When she arrived, she was taken to the Tower. It was Palm Sunday, the 18th of March, 1554, and it was raining. There is a story, possibly true, that when Elizabeth was brought to the entrance of the Tower by barge, she sat down on the wet stones and refused to move, saying she was no traitor. Whether or not it happened exactly that way, the image has endured because it captures something real about the moment. She was 20 years old. She was being taken to the place where her mother had been killed, and she did not know if she would come out again. She was held in the Tower for 2 months. She was questioned. She was watched. She was allowed almost no contact with the outside world. The room she occupied was small, and the walls were thick, and the cold that lived in the stone did not relent. Other prisoners were executed during her time there. She could hear the sounds of the fortress, the guards, the gates, the river. She wrote a letter to Mary, careful and desperate in equal measure, protesting her innocence and begging for an audience. The letter survives. You can see it in the British Library, the handwriting neat at first, and then growing more agitated, and at the bottom of the page, where blank space remained that might have been used by her enemies to forge additional text, she drew diagonal lines across the empty space and signed her name. Even in that moment, even writing what she believed might be the last letter of her life, she was thinking about how her words might be manipulated. She was not executed. Mary, for all her suspicion, could not bring herself to kill her sister without proof, and proof was never found. Elizabeth was moved from the Tower to Woodstock in Oxfordshire, where she was kept under house arrest for nearly a year in conditions that were bleak and isolating. The house was in poor repair. The guards were unsympathetic. She was allowed few visitors and fewer comforts. It was, by any measure, a miserable existence. But she was alive. And this is where we are, at the end of this first passage. A young woman in her early 20s, sitting in a crumbling house in the English countryside, watched by guards who report her every movement to a sister who fears her and a court that does not trust her. She has already survived more than most people will face in a lifetime. She has lost her mother to the executioner's sword. She has been declared legitimate and illegitimate, princess and bastard, heir and nobody. She has been interrogated, imprisoned, and confined. She has learned that love is dangerous, that trust is a luxury she cannot afford, and that the distance between a throne and a scaffold is shorter than most people imagine. She does not know what is coming. She does not know that Mary will die in November of 1558, and that the crown will pass to her. She does not know that she will reign for 45 years, that she will face down the greatest naval power in the world, that she will hold together a kingdom riven by religious conflict through sheer force of will and political cunning. She does not know that 400 years after her death, people will still be telling her story, still trying to understand how a girl who was never supposed to survive became a queen who refused to be anything less than extraordinary. All of that is ahead of her. For now, there is only the quiet, the cold walls, the sound of rain on old stone. And somewhere inside her, beneath the caution and the fear and the hard-won stillness, something that has not broken and will not break. Not yet. Not ever, as it will turn out. But she does not know that either. She is simply sitting and waiting and surviving, which is what she has always done, and what she will continue to do until surviving becomes something else entirely. Something that looks, from the outside, remarkably like ruling. You are perhaps 8 years old, or maybe 9, and already the world has taught you something that most people do not learn until much later, if they learn it at all. You have learned that words are not simply vehicles for meaning. Words are instruments of survival. You sit in a schoolroom that is quiet and well appointed, a room with good light and a fire tended by servants, and you conjugate Latin verbs with a fluency that would be remarkable in a child twice your age. Your tutor watches you with an expression that mixes admiration with something harder to name, something closer to concern, because he understands, as perhaps you are only beginning to, that the education you are receiving is not merely academic. It is armor being fitted to your body, one plate at a time. Your tutor's name is Roger Ascham, and he is one of the finest scholars in England. He will later write of you with undisguised wonder, telling colleagues that your mind is sharper than most men's he has encountered at Cambridge, that your capacity for languages borders on the extraordinary. By the time you are a young woman, you will be fluent in French, Italian, Spanish, Welsh, Flemish, and you will read Latin and Greek with the ease of someone reading their own correspondence. But Ascham is not merely teaching you to translate Cicero or parse the rhetoric of Demosthenes. He is teaching you how thought itself works, how an argument is constructed, how a sentence can be turned so that it appears to concede while actually advancing, how silence, in the right moment, can say more than any oration. These are the tools of the humanist tradition, the Studia Humanitatis, and they are being planted in the mind of a child who will one day need them, not to pass examinations, but to stay alive. Let us slow down and look more carefully at the household in which you are growing up, because it tells you something essential about the particular kind of education that comes not from tutors, but from proximity to power and its consequences. After your mother's death, after the sharp fall of the executioner's blade at the Tower, when you were not yet 3 years old, you were placed in the care of various guardians. Your father, Henry VIII, kept you at a distance that was both physical and emotional. You were declared illegitimate by Act of Parliament. The title of princess was stripped from you. You became simply the Lady Elizabeth, a child of uncertain status, living in households that shifted according to the political weather. And the political weather in the England of Henry VIII was never settled for long. You lived for a time in the household of your father's sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. She was kind to you. She was intelligent and devout, and she gathered around her a circle of learned women and reformist thinkers. And in her household, you encountered something that must have felt, for a time, like stability. Catherine Parr believed in education for women. She believed that a sharp mind was not unbecoming in a girl, but rather a credit to her and to God. Under her roof, you studied with some of the best tutors available in England, and you flourished. But even this period of relative calm carried its own undercurrents of danger, because Catherine Parr's household was also the household of Thomas Seymour, Thomas Seymour was Catherine Parr's new husband after your father's death, and he was ambitious in the particular way that certain men at the Tudor court were ambitious, which is to say, recklessly, hungrily, with more appetite than judgment. He was the brother of the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, who governed England on behalf of your young half-brother, Edward VI, and Thomas wanted power of his own. He began to pay you attention. You were perhaps 14 years old. The attention was inappropriate. There were incidents, reported later in depositions, of early morning visits to your bedchamber, of tickling, of a strange and unsettling familiarity that blurred the line between playfulness and something much darker. Catherine Parr, who loved her husband, tried at first to make light of it. She even participated in some of the episodes, perhaps trying to normalize what she could not bring herself to confront. But eventually, she sent you away. And then Catherine Parr died in childbirth, and Thomas Seymour, now unmoored from even the pretense of propriety, began scheming openly. He spoke of marrying you. He stockpiled weapons. He attempted to break into the young king's chambers at night. He was arrested, tried, and executed for treason. And here is where you must understand what this meant for a girl of 15. The investigators came for your household. Your servants were interrogated. Your governess, Cat Ashley, who was the closest thing you had to a mother, was taken to the Tower. You yourself were questioned repeatedly by Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, a man whose job was to extract confessions. He wanted you to admit that you had conspired with Seymour, that you had agreed to marry him, that you were part of his treasonous plotting. Had you admitted to any of this, your life would have been in genuine danger. You were 15 years old, and you were being interrogated by a skilled and determined agent of the state. And the wrong word, the wrong implication, the wrong inflection could have led you to the scaffold where your mother had died. You gave them nothing. The letters you wrote during this period survive, and they are remarkable documents. They are the letters of a young woman who understood, with a precision that seems almost impossible for someone her age, exactly how much to say and how much to leave unsaid. You expressed shock at the accusations. You protested your innocence. You were deferential to the Lord Protector's authority. You were careful, so careful, never to contradict anything your servants might have said under interrogation, because you did not know what they had said, and a contradiction could be fatal. You asked for permission to come to court so that you could clear your name in person, knowing that this request would be denied, but understanding that the act of asking made you appear confident in your innocence. Every sentence in those letters is a small feat of navigation, a boat threading between rocks in the dark. Sir Robert Tyrwhitt wrote to the Lord Protector with something approaching frustration. He said that you had a very good wit, and that nothing could be gotten from you. He did not mean this as a compliment, but it was one. You were 15, and you had outmaneuvered a professional interrogator, and you had done it with words. Not with power, not with allies, not with armies, with words, and with the silences between them. This is the education that matters. Yes, the Latin and the Greek and the French and the Italian all matter. The rhetoric matters. The hours spent with Ascom parsing the structures of classical argument matter. But what transforms these scholarly attainments into something truly formidable is the crucible in which they were tested. You did not learn the art of careful speech in a university. You learned it because careless speech could kill you. The years that follow the Seymour affair are years of deliberate quiet. You retreat from the court. You cultivate an image of scholarly modesty, of Protestant piety, of a young woman interested in books and needlework and nothing else. You dress simply. You appear in public infrequently. When your brother Edward is king, you are cautious with him, affectionate but measured. You understand, even as a teenager, that the court is a place where every gesture is observed, and every observation is reported, and every report is interpreted by people whose interpretations could determine whether you live or die. And then Edward dies. He is 15 years old, consumed by what was almost certainly tuberculosis, and in his final weeks he is persuaded to alter the succession, to bypass both you and your sister Mary in favour of Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin who can be controlled by the men around her. Lady Jane Grey is proclaimed Queen. She lasts 9 days. Your sister Mary, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, Catholic and determined, rides into London at the head of a growing army of supporters, and the nation rallies to her because whatever their feelings about religion, the English have a deep attachment to the legitimate line of succession, and Mary is the legitimate heir. Lady Jane Grey is deposed, imprisoned, and eventually executed. She is 16 years old when she dies. You watch all of this. You watch and you learn. Mary becomes queen, and at first there is warmth between you. She is your elder sister. She has suffered her own long years of humiliation and neglect under your father's reign, declared illegitimate just as you were, kept from her mother, pressured to renounce her Catholic faith. There is a bond of shared suffering between you, but it cannot hold. Mary is Catholic to the very core of her being, and she is determined to return England to the Roman faith. You are Protestant, or at least you have been raised Protestant, and are associated in the public mind with the Protestant cause. And this makes you dangerous. It does not matter that you attend Mass when Mary asks you to. It does not matter that you make outward shows of conformity. You are the heir to the throne, and you are Protestant. And as long as you exist, there will be people who look to you as an alternative to Mary's Catholic restoration. Mary knows this. Her advisors know this. The Spanish ambassador, Simon Renard, who represents the interests of Mary's cousin, the Emperor Charles V, knows this and says so plainly. He tells Mary that you are a threat. He suggests, not always subtly, that the threat should be removed. In early 1554, a rebellion breaks out. It is led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, and its ostensible cause is opposition to Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. But its deeper currents are Protestant, and Wyatt's ultimate aim, whether he admits it or not, is to place you on the throne. The rebellion fails, Wyatt is captured and executed, and the question turns to you. Were you involved? Did you know? Did you encourage it? Did you correspond with Wyatt or his co-conspirators? You are summoned to London. You are ill, or you say you are ill, and the journey takes longer than it should. And when you arrive, you are brought not to the court, but to the Tower of London, the place where your mother died, the place where countless traitors and fallen favourites have spent their last days. You are 20 years old, and you are being taken through the same gate that has swallowed so many who never came out again. There is a story, often repeated, that when you arrived at the tower by barge, you refused at first to step out, that you sat on the wet stones of the landing and declared that you were no traitor, that the rain fell on you and the guards stood uncertainly, and finally you rose and walked in because there was nothing else to do. Whether this happened exactly as the story says, we cannot be entirely sure. But we know you were there. We know you were imprisoned in the tower for 2 months. We know that during those 2 months, you did not know whether you would leave alive. And once again, it was your words that saved you. Before you were taken to the tower, you asked for permission to write to your sister. The letter you composed is one of the most famous letters in English history. It is sometimes called the tide letter because you wrote it slowly enough that the tide turned and the barge could not take you to the tower that day, buying you one more night of freedom. In the letter, you begged Mary to see you before condemning you. You invoked the principle that no person should be punished on the word of others without being heard in their own defense. You wrote with a desperate eloquence that was also, characteristically, precise. You did not grovel. You did not confess. You maintained your innocence, and you did so in language that was measured and clear and very difficult to use against you. Mary did not see you. You went to the tower, but no evidence was found to connect you to Wyatt's rebellion. Wyatt himself on the scaffold declared that you had known nothing of his plans. After 2 months you were released, not to freedom, but to house arrest at Woodstock, where you would spend nearly a year under guard, isolated, watched, your movements restricted, your correspondence monitored. But you were alive. Think about what these years have done to you. Think about the particular kind of intelligence that is forged in conditions like these. You have watched your mother's reputation destroyed and her head taken from her body. You have been declared illegitimate and then restored and then endangered again. You have been inappropriately handled by an ambitious man and then interrogated about it by agents of the state. You have watched a 16-year-old girl put on the throne and then taken off it and killed. You have been imprisoned in the Tower of London under suspicion of treason against your own sister. And through all of it, the thing that has kept you alive is not strength of arms, or powerful allies, or good fortune, though fortune has played its part. The thing that has kept you alive is your ability to control what you say, to read the intentions of others, to present yourself as whatever the moment requires you to be, and to wait. The art of waiting is perhaps the most underappreciated of all political skills. It is not dramatic. It does not make for stirring scenes in plays or films. But for Elizabeth, the years of waiting, the years of being watched, of being suspected, of being one misstep away from destruction, were the years that made her. She learned patience not as a virtue, but as a survival strategy. She learned that the person who moves first is often the person who loses. She learned that ambiguity is a form of protection, that if no one is entirely sure what you think or what you intend, no one can pin you to a position that might later become fatal. Roger Ascham had taught her the structures of classical rhetoric, the way an argument could be built, and then turned, and then resolved. But life under the reigns of Edward and Mary taught her something that Ascham's textbooks could not. It taught her that sometimes the most powerful rhetorical move is not to make an argument at all. Sometimes the most powerful move is to leave the sentence unfinished, the question unanswered, the letter just ambiguous enough that it cannot be used as evidence against you. There is a word in Italian, sprezzatura, that was fashionable among the educated classes of the 16th century. It means, roughly, the art of making difficult things look effortless, of concealing the effort behind the grace. Elizabeth had a version of this that was all her own. She made survival look like serenity. She made watchfulness look like modesty. She made the most intense and calculating political intelligence of her generation look like a young woman, quietly reading her books and saying her prayers, and waiting for whatever God might bring. By the time Mary died in November of 1558, and Elizabeth received the news that she was queen, she had spent nearly her entire life being educated, not just in the formal sense, though her formal education was extraordinary. She had been educated by danger. She had been educated by loss. She had been educated by the constant proximity of death, not as an abstraction, but as a specific and vivid possibility, a door that was always slightly ajar in the room where she was living. When the messengers came to Hatfield House to tell her that Mary was dead and the throne was hers, she is reported to have sunk to her knees and spoken a line from the Psalms in Latin. E domino factum est istud, et est mirabile in oculis nostris. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes. It is a beautiful moment, and it may even have been spontaneous, though with Elizabeth it is always difficult to know where genuine feeling ends and performance begins. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the greatest lesson of her education was that feeling and performance need not be separate things, that you can mean what you say with your whole heart and still choose the perfect words in which to say it, that sincerity and strategy are not opposites, but partners. She was 25 years old. She had survived everything that the Tudor court could throw at a person, and she had survived it not through luck or through the protection of powerful men, but through the disciplined, relentless application of her own intelligence. She had been a bastard, a suspect, a prisoner, a pawn in other people's schemes, and now she was queen. And every lesson she had learned in those long and dangerous years, every skill she had honed in silence and in fear, she would carry with her to the throne and use for the next 44 years. The education of Elizabeth was complete. what she would do with it was about to begin. You are standing in the January cold, and it has seeped into everything. It is in the stones beneath your feet, and in the fabric of your clothes, and in the iron railings that line the streets of London. And when you breathe, the air itself feels like something solid entering your lungs. The year is 1559. The month is January. The day is the 15th. And the city around you is alive with a kind of trembling, nervous energy that has been building for weeks. Because today, a young woman of 25 is going to be crowned Queen of England. And no one, not a single soul in this enormous, restless crowd, knows quite what to make of it. You have been standing here for a long time already. The procession from the Tower to Westminster began yesterday, a slow and elaborate progress through streets that had been cleaned and draped and sanded against the winter mud. And Elizabeth rode through them in an open litter, carried by mules draped in gold cloth, and she stopped again and again to receive flowers, to listen to speeches, to touch the hands of ordinary people who pressed toward her. She had an instinct for it that was almost unsettling. A small child offered her a sprig of rosemary near Fenchurch Street, and she held it in her hands for the rest of the procession, visibly, so that everyone could see she had accepted a gift from a common child and was treasuring it. These were not accidental gestures. Nothing about this woman was accidental. But there was a warmth in the performance that was hard to dismiss as mere calculation. And the people of London, who had endured so much in the preceding years, who had watched the burnings under Mary and felt the constant gnawing fear of religious persecution, responded to her with something that went beyond loyalty. They responded with relief. Now it is the morning after the procession, and you are at Westminster Abbey, and the cold inside the Abbey is worse than the cold outside, because stone holds the winter in a way that open air does not. The Abbey is full. Every seat, every standing space, every gallery and alcove is packed with bodies, and yet the sound is oddly muted, a low, rustling hum of people breathing and shifting and waiting. The ceremony is ancient, its forms stretching back through centuries of English monarchy, and there is a comfort in that antiquity, in the idea that whatever else changes, the rituals of coronation endure. But today, there is also a subtle, pervasive uncertainty. The bishop performing the ceremony is not the Archbishop of Canterbury, because the current Archbishop has refused to crown her. Several other senior bishops have also declined. They are men loyal to the old faith, Mary's faith, and they see this young woman as illegitimate in more ways than one. Eventually, a junior bishop, Owen Oglethorpe, the Bishop of Carlisle, has agreed to perform the rite. It is not the most auspicious beginning. Even the act of being crowned requires Elizabeth to negotiate, to compromise, to find the one person in the room willing to do what needs to be done. She will become very good at this. The ceremony unfolds slowly, the way all medieval ceremonies do, weighted with symbolism and repetition. There is the recognition, where the new sovereign is presented to the congregation at each of the four corners of the abbey, and the people are asked to affirm their acceptance. There is the oath. There is the anointing, the most sacred part, when holy oil is applied and the sovereign is understood to receive a kind of divine sanction. Elizabeth will later tell the Bishop of Carlisle not to elevate the host during the Mass that follows the coronation, because she does not want the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation to be affirmed at her crowning. He will do it anyway. She will leave the chapel before the Mass concludes. Already, on the very first day, the negotiation between old faith and new faith is visible in these small, quiet acts of resistance and accommodation. Already the pattern of her reign is taking shape. But you do not need to follow the theology too closely right now. What you need to feel is the weight of the crown as it is placed on her head. It is St. Edward's crown, heavy, made of solid gold, and it sits on the head of a woman who 2 years ago was a prisoner, who 5 years ago might reasonably have expected to die before she reached this age. The crown is so heavy that it will be exchanged for a lighter one later in the ceremony. But for now, in this moment, it presses down on her temples and her forehead and the bones of her skull. And whatever she feels, she holds herself steady beneath it. The congregation erupts. The trumpets sound. The cheering rolls outward from the abbey into the streets, carried by the voices of thousands who cannot see what is happening inside, but who know, from the noise alone, that it is done. Elizabeth is queen, and almost immediately, before the coronation banquet has even finished, before the new queen has had a chance to settle into the vast and complicated machinery of her new role, the question begins. It starts quietly at first, in the murmured conversations of ambassadors and councillors and foreign princes, and then it grows louder and more insistent, and it will not stop for the next 30 years. The question is simple. Whom will you marry? It is difficult, from the distance of centuries, to fully appreciate how central this question was, how completely it dominated the political life of Elizabeth's early reign. To her councillors, to her parliament, to every foreign court in Europe, the question of Elizabeth's marriage was not a personal matter. It was the most urgent political question in the world. England had a young, unmarried queen with no heir. If she died without a successor, the country would be plunged into a succession crisis that could easily become a civil war. The memory of the Wars of the Roses, of decades of bloodshed fought over competing claims to the throne, was less than a century old. It lived in the bones of the English political class. They needed Elizabeth to marry. They needed her to produce an heir. And they needed it to happen soon. You can feel the pressure of it if you sit with it long enough. Imagine being 25 years old, newly crowned, surrounded by men who are older than you and who believe, with the absolute certainty of their age and their sex, that they know what is best for you and for the country. Imagine that every conversation you have with a foreign ambassador contains somewhere within it, the implicit or explicit suggestion of a husband. The King of Spain offers himself. The Archduke Charles of Austria is proposed. The King of Sweden sends envoys. The Duke of Anjou, the Duke of Alençon, various German princes and French nobles. The list is long, and it changes over the years, but the underlying message is always the same. You are a woman. You cannot rule alone. You must have a husband to share and, in truth, to take over the burden of governance. This is not cruelty. This is simply what almost everyone in the 16th century believes to be true. And Elizabeth's response to this pressure is one of the most remarkable, sustained performances in the history of statecraft. She does not refuse to marry. That would be too simple, too clean, too easy to counter. Instead, she considers it. She considers it endlessly. She entertains proposals. She sends envoys to negotiate terms. She allows courtships to progress to the point where treaties are nearly signed and wedding dates are nearly set. And then she hesitates. She delays. She raises new conditions. She retreats. She keeps the question alive, year after year, decade after decade. Because as long as the question is alive, she holds power over everyone who wants the answer. Think of it this way. If you are the King of Spain and you believe there is a chance that Elizabeth might marry your candidate, you will be careful in your dealings with England. You will not press too hard on matters of trade or territory or religion, because you do not want to offend a queen who might soon become your ally through marriage. If you are a member of Elizabeth's Parliament and you believe she is seriously considering a match, you will be more patient, more accommodating, more willing to grant her the funds and the freedoms she needs to govern, because you believe the marriage is coming, and with it, the heir that will secure the succession. The unmarried state of the Queen becomes a kind of diplomatic currency, endlessly renewable, never quite spent. Elizabeth understands this with a clarity that is almost frightening. She understands that the moment she marries, she loses the single most powerful tool she possesses. A husband would demand authority. A husband would bring foreign alliances and foreign obligations. A husband would, in the eyes of the world and in the legal frameworks of the time, become the true ruler. And Elizabeth would become what her sister Mary had been, a queen whose power was filtered through and diminished by the presence of a king. She had watched this happen. She had seen her sister's marriage to Philip of Spain drag England into a foreign war and a foreign faith. She had learned from it, but it would be a mistake to see Elizabeth's refusal to marry as purely strategic, as nothing more than cold political calculation. Something deeper is at work, something rooted in her childhood and in the particular horrors she witnessed growing up. Her mother had been married to a king, and the marriage had ended with her mother's head on a block. Her stepmother, Catherine Howard, had been married to the same king and had met the same fate. Her sister Mary's marriage had brought misery and forced pregnancies and national humiliation. Elizabeth had been proposed as a bride for Thomas Seymour when she was barely 14, and Seymour had been executed, and the investigation that followed had nearly destroyed her. Marriage, in Elizabeth's experience, was not a source of security. It was a source of danger. The crown was hers alone, and she intended to keep it that way. There is a moment early in her reign that captures this perfectly. In 1559, her first parliament petitions her to marry, framing the request in the most respectful and urgent terms they can manage. Elizabeth's response is careful, measured, and deliberately ambiguous. She tells them that she is already married to England. She shows them the coronation ring on her finger and says it is her wedding ring, the symbol of her bond with her people. The members of Parliament do not know what to do with this. It is not a refusal, exactly. It is something stranger and more disorienting. It is a redefinition of the question itself. Elizabeth is not saying she will never marry. She is saying that the terms of the conversation are hers to set, and that no one else gets to decide when, or whether, or whom. The years pass. The suitors come and go. The most serious courtship of the early reign is not with a foreign prince at all, but with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, a man Elizabeth has known since childhood, a man she clearly loves in some complicated and deeply personal way. Dudley is handsome, ambitious, charming, and spectacularly unsuitable. He is not of royal blood. He is the son of a man who was executed for treason. And when his wife, Amy Robsart, is found dead at the bottom of a staircase in 1560, the scandal is so enormous that any possibility of Elizabeth marrying him is effectively destroyed. Whether Amy Robsart's death was an accident, a suicide, or something darker has never been settled. But the effect on Dudley's candidacy is immediate and permanent. Elizabeth cannot marry a man suspected of murdering his wife. The whispers would never stop. The legitimacy of the crown would be compromised. And yet she keeps Dudley close. She keeps him at court, showers him with honours and lands, makes him a privy councillor, creates him Earl of Leicester. She dances with him. She rides with him. She lets the world see their intimacy, and she lets the world wonder. Is this love? Is this strategy? Is it possible that it is both at the same time? That Elizabeth is capable of holding genuine affection and political calculation in the same hand, without ever confusing one for the other? You begin to suspect that this is precisely what she does, over and over, throughout her reign. She feels things deeply, but she never allows what she feels to override what she knows. The foreign courtships continue. In the early 1570s, there are serious negotiations with the Duke of Anjou, the brother of the French king. Elizabeth is in her late 30s now, and the biological urgency of the marriage question is becoming acute. If she is going to produce an heir, time is running short. The Anjou match has real political advantages. It would bind England and France together against the growing power of Spain, and it would give Elizabeth a husband who is young enough and junior enough that she might reasonably expect to dominate him. The negotiations drag on for years. Elizabeth seems genuinely interested. She gives Anjou a pet name, her Frog, and when he visits England in 1579, she appears delighted by him. She kisses him in public. She exchanges rings with him. The court is thrown into confusion. Is she serious this time? Is the Virgin Queen finally going to marry? She is not. The Anjou courtship ends the way all the others end, in delay and equivocation and the quiet dissolution of something that never quite solidified into commitment. The French prince goes home. Elizabeth keeps his letters, and the question of her marriage, slowly, almost imperceptibly, begins to lose its urgency. Not because anyone has answered it, but because time itself has answered it. Elizabeth is moving past the age of childbearing. The possibility of a direct heir is fading. And yet, England has not collapsed. The succession crisis that everyone feared has not materialized, in part because Elizabeth has managed the question so skillfully that the fear of it has been deferred, year by year, into a future that never quite arrives. You sit with this for a while, and you begin to understand something about the nature of power as Elizabeth practiced it. She understood that in politics, a decision deferred is not the same as a decision avoided. Delay itself can be a form of action. By refusing to resolve the marriage question, she kept the field of possibilities open. And as long as the field was open, she retained control over it. The moment she chose a husband, the field would close, and all the consequences of that choice, the alliances gained and lost, the power shifted and redistributed, would become fixed and irreversible. Elizabeth preferred to live in the space before the decision, in the productive ambiguity of maybe. This was infuriating to the people around her. Her councillors begged her to decide. Her parliaments petitioned her again and again. William Cecil, her most trusted adviser, wrote her long and careful memos laying out the arguments for various matches. And Elizabeth read them and thanked him and did nothing. She was not indecisive. She was something more unusual and more dangerous than that. She was a person who understood that the appearance of indecision could be a weapon, that keeping everyone guessing was a way of keeping everyone in check. And here is the thing that makes all of this more than just a clever trick. Elizabeth was not playing a game. Or rather, she was playing a game, but the stakes were her life and the survival of her country, and she knew it. If she married the wrong person, she could lose everything. If she married at all, she would be diminished in ways that were structural and almost impossible to resist. The laws and customs of the time gave husbands authority over their wives in ways that were profound and pervasive. A queen who married became, in some fundamental sense, less of a queen. Elizabeth looked at this reality with clear eyes, and she made her choice. She chose herself. She chose the crown. She chose to be alone in a way that no English monarch had ever been alone before. And she turned that aloneness into a source of strength that her enemies never fully understood and her allies never fully appreciated. The cold of that January morning in 1559 has long since faded. The coronation is years in the past. You are somewhere in the middle of Elizabeth's reign now, in the long stretch of years where the marriage question has become a familiar background hum, always present, never resolved. And you begin to notice something else, something that grows out of the marriage question, but extends far beyond it. Elizabeth has begun to construct a mythology around herself, a public identity so powerful and so strange that it will outlast her by centuries. She is the Virgin Queen. She is Gloriana. She is married to her people. She has taken the thing that the world sees as her weakness, her unmarried, childless state, and she has turned it into the foundation of a cult of personality that rivals anything in the history of European monarchy. This does not happen all at once. It builds slowly, through portraits and poems and speeches and pageants, through the careful management of her public image and the equally careful management of her private mysteries. Elizabeth controls what people see of her. She controls the portraits, literally, issuing proclamations about how she may be depicted, approving face patterns that artists must follow. The image that emerges is of a woman who does not age, who is beyond the ordinary limitations of the body, who is something more than human. It is propaganda, of course, but it is propaganda of such sophistication and such sustained commitment that it takes on a life of its own, and the line between the myth and the woman becomes, over time, very difficult to find. You are tired now, perhaps, and the details are beginning to blur into one another, and that is fine. Let them blur. What matters is not the name of every suitor or the date of every parliamentary petition. What matters is the shape of the thing, the long, slow arc of a woman who was told, from the moment she took the crown, that she was incomplete without a husband, and who spent the next 44 years proving that incompleteness could be its own kind of power. She never married. She never produced an heir. And when she died, the succession passed peacefully to James of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. And England did not collapse, and there was no civil war, and the fears that had driven the marriage question for decades turned out to have been, if not groundless, at least manageable. Elizabeth had bet her reign on the idea that she could hold the country together by the force of her own will and her own intelligence, without the support of a husband, without the security of an heir. And she won that bet. Not easily, not without cost, but she won it. You are standing in a room that smells of ink and beeswax and the faint staleness of too many bodies in too small a space. The walls are panelled in dark wood. The ceiling is low enough that you are aware of it, not oppressively so, but enough that it shapes the feeling of the room into something close and contained, like the inside of a box designed for thinking. There is a long table, and around it sit perhaps a dozen men, some of them old enough that their hands tremble slightly when they reach for papers, some of them younger, with eyes that move too quickly, cataloguing who is speaking and who is listening, and who is pretending to do neither. At the head of this table, or rather, at its spiritual centre, because she does not always sit at the physical head, is Elizabeth. And she is working. This is not the Elizabeth of the portraits. Not yet. Or rather, the Elizabeth of the portraits is a performance she has not yet fully refined, though she is refining it every day, in rooms exactly like this one. Right now, she is a woman in her late 20s, tall and angular, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's commanding way of occupying space. She is listening. She is almost always listening. When she speaks, it is with a precision that makes the men around the table choose their own words more carefully, because they have learned, some of them very quickly, and some of them only after painful correction, that she remembers everything. Not in a general sense, not the way a person might recall the gist of a conversation. She remembers the specific words you used. She remembers the date you used them. And she will, at a moment you do not expect, produce those words again and set them beside whatever you are saying now, and ask you, with a tone that is not quite cold, but is certainly not warm, to explain the distance between then and now. This is the Privy Council. This is where England is governed. And to understand Elizabeth as a ruler, not as a symbol or a legend or a face on a coin, you need to spend some time in this room, because this is where the texture of her power actually lived. Not in speeches, not in pageants. Here, at a table covered in papers, surrounded by men who believed, most of them with absolute sincerity, that a woman was not capable of this work. The Privy Council in the early years of Elizabeth's reign was not a cabinet in the modern sense. It was a body of advisers selected by the monarch whose role was to counsel and to administer. They did not vote on policy the way a parliament might. They advised, and the Queen decided. But of course it was never that simple, because the men who sat on the council were not merely advisers. They were powerful figures in their own right, with lands and retainers and alliances and ambitions. And the act of advising was always, always entangled with the act of manoeuvring. Elizabeth understood this from the very beginning. She understood it because she had spent her entire life watching powerful men maneuver around powerful thrones, and she had seen what happened when a monarch failed to manage that process. Her father had managed it through sheer force of will and occasional terror. Her brother's regents had managed it badly. Her sister had managed it by leaning too heavily on a single faction. Elizabeth intended to manage it differently. The man you need to notice first is William Cecil. He is already seated when you arrive. He is always already seated. He arrived early. He has papers arranged in front of him, in an order that makes sense only to him, but that allows him to produce any document the Queen might ask for within moments. He is not physically imposing. He is careful in his dress, neither ostentatious nor plain, the clothing of a man who wishes to be taken seriously, but not envied. His face is the kind of face that is easy to underestimate if you are foolish, because it is calm and patient and gives very little away. He has been with Elizabeth since before she was queen. He was part of her household during the dangerous years, and when she ascended to the throne, he was the first appointment she made. She called him her spirit. She would call him that for 40 years. Cecil, who would later become Lord Burleigh, was Elizabeth's principal secretary and then her Lord Treasurer, and his relationship with the Queen is one of the most remarkable partnerships in the history of governance. It was not a friendship, exactly, though there was genuine affection in it. It was not a marriage, though it lasted longer than most marriages and involved more arguments than many of them. It was a working relationship of extraordinary depth and complexity, built on mutual respect and frequent, sometimes furious disagreement. Cecil was cautious by nature. He was a planner, a list maker, a man who preferred to see every possible outcome laid out on paper before committing to a course of action. Elizabeth shared some of these qualities, but not all of them. Where Cecil wanted clarity, Elizabeth often preferred ambiguity. Where Cecil wanted decisions made and implemented, Elizabeth wanted decisions delayed until the last possible moment, and sometimes well beyond it. This drove Cecil to distraction. It drove nearly everyone who worked with Elizabeth to distraction. The delay, the endless, maddening delay. You would bring her a matter that required a decision. You would lay out the arguments. You would present the evidence. She would listen. She would ask questions, sharp questions, questions that revealed she understood the matter at least as well as you did, and possibly better. And then she would do nothing. Days would pass. Weeks. You would raise the matter again. She would deflect. Or she would revisit arguments you thought had been settled. Or she would introduce new considerations that sent the entire discussion spiraling back to its beginning. And you would sit in your quarters at night and write letters to your allies in which you described, with barely concealed exasperation, the impossibility of getting this woman to make up her mind. But here is the thing you must understand, and it is the thing that many of her contemporaries never fully understood, though the cleverer ones began to glimpse it. The delay was not indecision, or rather, it was not only indecision. Sometimes Elizabeth genuinely did not know what to do, and she was honest enough with herself, if not always with others, to admit the uncertainty, rather than mask it with false confidence. But often the delay was itself the decision. By not choosing, she preserved options. By not committing, she kept other parties uncertain and therefore controllable. A suitor who has been refused will go away. A suitor who has been neither accepted nor refused will stay. And while he stays, he is useful. An ally who has been given a definitive answer has no reason to continue negotiating. An ally who is still waiting for an answer will continue to offer concessions. Elizabeth understood, intuitively and then deliberately, that in a world where England was a second-tier power surrounded by larger and wealthier rivals, the ability to keep everyone guessing was not a weakness. It was a strategy. You can see this playing out at the council table on almost any given day. A letter has arrived from the French ambassador regarding a proposed alliance. Cecil wants to respond promptly and clearly. because he has calculated the strategic advantages and disadvantages and has determined that a modified acceptance with certain conditions would serve England's interests. Another counsellor, perhaps the Earl of Leicester, who is Robert Dudley, the Queen's favourite, wants a different response entirely, one that aligns with his own factional interests and his own vision of England's place in the world. A third voice, perhaps Nicholas Bacon, the Lord Keeper, offers a legal perspective. Elizabeth listens to all of them. She asks Cecil to elaborate on a particular point. She asks Leicester a question that subtly undercuts his position without appearing to challenge him directly. She thanks Bacon for his analysis, and then she moves to the next item on the agenda without having given any indication of what she intends to do about the French letter. The counsellors exchange glances. Cecil makes a note. Leicester fumes quietly. The letter sits unanswered for another week, and during that week, the French ambassador, growing anxious, makes an additional concession that he had previously refused to consider.
Now notice the other man you need to watch.
He is not yet at the table in the early years, but he will arrive soon enough. And when he does, the dynamic of governance will shift in important ways. Francis Walsingham is younger than Cecil, leaner in both body and temperament, with a darkness about him that is not menacing exactly, but is certainly not comfortable. Where Cecil is the architect, Walsingham is the spy master. He will build, over the course of the 1570s and 1580s, one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in Europe. A web of agents and informers and code breakers that stretches from the taverns of London to the courts of Paris and Madrid and Rome. Walsingham's world is the world of secrets, of intercepted letters and double agents and plots uncovered in their early stages before they can bear fruit. He is a Puritan by conviction, fierce in his Protestantism in a way that Elizabeth sometimes finds useful and sometimes finds tiresome. And he is utterly devoted to the security of the realm, which, in his mind, is inseparable from the security of the Protestant faith. Elizabeth's relationship with Walsingham is different from her relationship with Cecil. She trusts Cecil with her policy. She trusts Walsingham with her safety. But trust is perhaps too simple a word. She relies on Walsingham, and she values the intelligence he provides. But she is also wary of him in a way she is not wary of Cecil, because Walsingham has an agenda that goes beyond mere service. He wants to push England toward a more aggressively Protestant foreign policy. He wants open confrontation with Spain. He wants Mary, Queen of Scots, dealt with permanently. And Elizabeth, who has survived her entire life by avoiding permanent commitments and irreversible actions, resists this pressure with the same maddening patience she applies to everything else. What you are witnessing at this council table is not a queen being advised. It is a queen managing. She is managing personalities, managing factions, managing the flow of information so that no single advisor ever has a complete picture. Because a complete picture would give that advisor too much power. She shares certain intelligence with Cecil that she withholds from Leicester. She discusses certain matters with Leicester in private that she never raises in council. She allows Walsingham to pursue certain investigations, but reins him in when his enthusiasm threatens to create the very crises he claims to be preventing. She is, in modern terms, the chief executive of a complex organization, and she runs that organization with a combination of charm, intimidation, strategic ambiguity, and an almost inhuman capacity for sustained attention to detail. Consider the question of patronage, because patronage is the fuel that powers the entire machinery of Elizabethan government. Every appointment, every grant of land, every monopoly, every license to export wool or import wine passes through the Queen's hands, or through hands she has authorized. This is not a bureaucratic formality. This is the mechanism by which loyalty is rewarded, ambition is channeled, and potential rivals are kept dependent. Elizabeth manages this system with extraordinary care. She is, by the standards of her time, relatively frugal with patronage. She does not scatter rewards lavishly the way some monarchs do, buying loyalty in bulk and hoping it holds. She parcels out rewards slowly, in measured amounts, keeping supplicants waiting just long enough that the reward, when it finally comes, carries maximum weight. And she is not above withdrawing favour as suddenly as she grants it, which keeps even her most established courtiers in a state of productive anxiety.
This anxiety is by design. You can feel it in the room if you stand quietly in the corner and watch. The men at this table are powerful, but their power flows from her, and they know it, and she knows they know it, and this shared knowledge is the invisible architecture that holds the entire structure together. When Elizabeth loses her temper in council, which she does with some regularity, it is not always genuine anger. Sometimes it is a performance designed to remind everyone present that she is not merely the chair of a committee. She is the Queen. The distinction matters. When she bangs the table and tells a councillor that his advice is foolish, she is not necessarily rejecting his advice. She is reminding him, and everyone else in the room, that advice is what they offer, and decisions are what she makes. And the two are not the same thing. There is a moment, and it is a small moment, barely recorded, but it captures something essential. Cecil has presented a memorandum on a matter of some complexity, perhaps a question of taxation or a dispute over jurisdiction. He has laid out the arguments with his usual thoroughness. Elizabeth reads the memorandum in silence. The room waits. She picks up a pen and begins to write in the margin of his paper. And what she writes is not a simple yes or no, but a series of questions and modifications that reveal she has not merely understood his argument, but has seen implications within it that he has not fully articulated. She hands the paper back to him. He reads her notes. There is a pause, and then he nods, slowly, and you can see in his expression something that looks very much like respect being renewed, as if he has been reminded once again that the person he serves is not a figurehead, but a mind. This is how the days accumulate. This is the texture of governance. It is not glamorous. There are no trumpets in this room, no ermine robes, no golden sceptres. There are papers and ink, and the quiet scratching of pens, and the murmur of voices debating grain supplies and harbour fortifications, and the wording of a letter to a foreign prince. Elizabeth is here for hours. She reads dispatches in French and Italian and Latin without requiring translation. She drafts responses in her own hand when the matter is sensitive enough that she does not trust a secretary. She understands the financial position of the crown with a specificity that surprises her treasurers, because she has made it her business to understand it, because she knows that a queen who does not understand her own treasury is a queen who is dependent on the men who do. And through all of this, there is the constant, grinding pressure of being a woman in a role that the entire intellectual framework of the age insists is unsuitable for women. The arguments are everywhere. They are in sermons and in treatises and in the casual assumptions of the men who serve her. John Knox has published his infamous blast against the monstrous regiment of women. Catholic polemicists use her sex as evidence that her reign is unnatural. Even her own supporters frame their loyalty in terms that subtly diminish her, praising her for governing like a man, as if competence in a woman is a kind of successful impersonation. Elizabeth navigates this pressure with a rhetorical brilliance that deserves its own study. She does not reject her femininity. She does not pretend to be a man. Instead, she constructs a public identity that incorporates her womanhood into her authority, rather than setting the two in opposition. She is the Virgin Queen, the mother of her people, the bride of England. These are not merely slogans. They are solutions to a political problem that no one else in her position had ever had to solve at this scale. At the council table, the solution takes a different form. Here, among the men who work most closely with her, the rhetoric gives way to something more direct. She does not persuade them with symbols. She outworks them. She outthinks them. She outlasts them. When they bring her problems, she brings them better questions. When they present false choices, she identifies the third option they hoped she would not see. When they try to stampede her into a decision by presenting a situation as urgent, she slows down, deliberately, almost ostentatiously, because she has learned that urgency is often a tactic employed by people who benefit from a particular outcome and fear that reflection will lead to a different one. The room is growing dim now. Candles have been lit. The session has gone on for hours, and some of the older councillors are visibly tired. Cecil's hand is steady, but the skin beneath his eyes is dark. Lester is leaning back in his chair with the studied casualness of a man who wants to appear unbothered by how long this is taking. Elizabeth shows no sign of fatigue. She is asking about a report from the northern borders, and her questions are as sharp now as they were at the beginning of the session. This stamina is not incidental. It is part of how she governs. She tires them out. She waits for the moment when their attention flags, and then raises the most important matter of the day, the one she has been saving, and addresses it while they are too exhausted to argue effectively. Whether this is conscious strategy or simply a byproduct of her own restless energy is impossible to say. Perhaps it is both. When the session finally ends and the councillors file out, you stay behind for a moment. The room is quiet now. The papers are still spread across the table. A servant enters to clear the candles, and you catch a glimpse of Elizabeth standing by the window. looking out at the darkening courtyard. She is alone, briefly. In a way, she is almost never alone. And her posture in this unguarded moment is not regal or commanding. It is simply still. She is a woman standing at a window at the end of a long day of work. And tomorrow, there will be another day exactly like it. And another after that. And another. Stretching out for years, for decades. The same table, the same arguments, the same slow, patient accumulation of small decisions that together will shape the fate of a nation. This is what ruling looked like. Not the crown, not the throne, not the speeches or the processions. This. A woman at a table, reading and listening and thinking and waiting, holding power not by seizing it in dramatic moments, but by exercising it carefully and relentlessly in ordinary ones. The men around her would grow old in her service. Some of them would die in it. Cecil would serve her for nearly 4 decades, growing frail and ill, carried to council meetings in a chair toward the end, still bringing his papers, still making his careful arguments, still receiving her sharp questions in return. Their partnership would outlast wars and plagues and conspiracies and the rise and fall of favourites. And when Cecil finally died in 1598, Elizabeth would grieve him with a privacy that told you more about what he meant to her than any public display could have. But that grief is years away yet. Tonight the candles are being snuffed, and the palace is settling into its nighttime rhythms. And Elizabeth is turning from the window and moving toward her private chambers, where more papers wait. Because the work does not stop when the council session ends. It only changes rooms. And you walk a few steps behind her, unseen, watching the way she moves through her own palace, with the quiet confidence of someone who has learned, through years of danger and years of study and years of sitting at that table and proving herself equal to every mind assembled around it, that this place is hers. Not because she inherited it, though she did. Not because God ordained it, though she claims he did. But because she has earned it, day after day after day, in the slow, unglamorous work of governance, holding power in a world that never wanted to give it to her, and never quite forgave her for taking it. You are standing in a field near the river, and the air is warm and heavy, with the particular stillness of an English August. The year is 1588, and the place is Tilbury, a stretch of low ground along the Thames estuary in Essex, where the river begins to widen and slow as it reaches toward the sea. Around you there are soldiers, thousands of them. They have been gathering here for days, arriving in loose columns from the surrounding counties, men carrying pikes and halberds, some in polished breastplates, and some in little more than padded jackets. The ground beneath your feet has been trampled into a kind of hard, dusty flatness, and the smell of horses and campfire smoke and sweat drifts across the field in layers. You can hear the low murmur of conversation,
the occasional clank of metal, the distant whinny of a mount being walked along the perimeter. No one here is entirely sure what is going to happen. That is the thing you notice most. Not fear exactly, but a particular quality of waiting, a tension that lives just beneath the surface of everything, the way a held breath lives beneath the ribcage. Out in the Channel, somewhere beyond the curve of the coast, the Spanish Armada is at sea. You have heard the numbers, or versions of them, passed from mouth to mouth with the usual distortions of rumour. 130 ships, perhaps more, carrying soldiers and sailors and supplies enough to mount an invasion of England. The fleet left Lisbon weeks ago, delayed by storms and provisioning troubles. But it is coming. Everyone knows it is coming. King Philip II of Spain has been planning this for years, assembling what he calls the most fortunate fleet, the armada that will cross the Channel, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army waiting in the Spanish Netherlands, and together they will land on English soil. The objective is nothing less than the overthrow of Elizabeth, the restoration of Catholic authority, and the end of Protestant England as a sovereign power. You stand here in this field, and you try to understand the scale of what is unfolding. But the truth is that in 1588, even the people directing the defence of England do not fully grasp it. Communication is slow. News arrives by rider, by dispatch boat, by breathless messenger. And it is always hours or days old by the time it reaches anyone who can act on it. The English fleet, under the command of Lord Howard of Effingham, and with Francis Drake as his vice-admiral, has already engaged the Armada in a series of running fights up the Channel, harrying the great crescent formation of Spanish ships with smaller, more manoeuvrable vessels. Fire ships have been sent among the anchored fleet at Calais, scattering the formation, breaking the careful discipline that had held the Armada together. But none of this is certain to you here at Tilbury. What is certain is the presence of your fellow soldiers around you, the weight of whatever weapon you are carrying, and the knowledge that if the Spanish land, this stretch of ground along the Thames is one of the places where they might come ashore. It is into this atmosphere that Elizabeth arrives. She comes on horseback, and the accounts that survive describe her wearing a white velvet gown and a silver breastplate, though the precise details have been softened and sharpened by centuries of retelling. What matters more than the exact colour of the fabric is what her presence here means. She has been advised against coming. Her council, those careful, anxious men who have spent decades trying to keep her alive, have told her that it is too dangerous, that an army camp is no place for a queen, that if the Spanish were to land, she would be exposed. She has come anyway. She has made the journey downriver from London, crossed to the Essex side, and ridden into the camp because she understands something that her advisors, for all their intelligence, sometimes miss. She understands that there are moments when the symbol must become the body, when the idea of a queen must take physical form and stand in front of the people who are being asked to die for her. You watch her ride slowly through the ranks. The horse beneath her moves at a walk. There is no rushing. She passes close enough that you can see her face, and what strikes you is not grandeur, but composure. She is 54 years old, which in this era is not young. She has been queen for nearly 30 years. She has survived plots and assassination attempts and excommunication and the relentless pressure of a world that has never quite accepted that a woman can hold the throne she holds. And now she is here, in a field, surrounded by men who are frightened and trying not to show it. And she is going to speak to them. The words she delivers that day at Tilbury will become among the most famous in the English language. Though like so many famous speeches of this period, the exact text is uncertain. The version that has come down to us may have been polished after the fact, shaped by memory and repetition into something sharper and more symmetrical than whatever she actually said. But the core of it survives, and the core is extraordinary. She tells the assembled soldiers that she knows she has the body of a weak and feeble woman, but that she has the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. She tells them that she thinks foul scorn that any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of her realm. She tells them she has come among them not for recreation or disport, but to live and die amongst them all, to lay down for her God and for her kingdom and for her people her honour and her blood, even in the dust. You stand in the field and you hear these words, and you feel something shift in the air around you. It is not magic. It is not some mystical transformation. It is something more practical and more human than that. It is the effect of a leader who has correctly read the emotional temperature of a crowd and spoken directly into it. The soldiers around you are afraid, and they are uncertain, and they are wondering whether any of this matters, whether England can actually withstand the might of Spain. And Elizabeth has come before them and acknowledged the very thing that her enemies use against her, the fact of her sex, the supposed weakness of a female ruler, and she has turned it inside out. She has said, yes, I am a woman, and I am here, and I will not leave, and I am not afraid. Whether she was actually unafraid is unknowable. What matters is that she stood there and said it, and the men believed her. Or at least, they believed that she believed it. And in that moment, that was enough. But the Tilbury speech, vivid and memorable as it is, sits within a much larger story. And to understand why Elizabeth was standing in that field at all, you have to go back years, decades even, and trace the slow, tangled web of religious conflict and political rivalry that brought the Spanish Armada to the English Channel. The roots go deep. They go back to the Reformation itself, to the break with Rome that Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, initiated, and that Elizabeth, by choosing Protestantism, continued. From the moment she took the throne in 1558, Elizabeth was a target for Catholic Europe. The Pope had excommunicated her in 1570, formally declaring her a heretic and releasing her Catholic subjects from their allegiance to her. This was not merely a spiritual gesture, it was a political weapon. It meant that any Catholic who assassinated Elizabeth
could consider themselves to be doing God's work. It meant that foreign powers who invaded England could frame their aggression as a holy crusade. Philip of Spain had his own specific grievances. He had been married to Elizabeth's sister Mary, and during Mary's reign, he had been king consort of England. When Mary died and Elizabeth took the throne, Philip had even proposed marriage to Elizabeth, imagining he could maintain his influence. Elizabeth declined, politely and then less politely, and over the following decades, the relationship between England and Spain deteriorated steadily. English privateers, men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, raided Spanish shipping and plundered Spanish colonies in the New World. Elizabeth supported Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands, sending money and eventually troops to aid their revolt against Philip's rule. Each provocation added another layer to Philip's determination, another justification for the great enterprise he was planning. And then there was Mary, Queen of Scots. You have encountered Mary before in this story, at least in passing, as a shadow that fell across Elizabeth's reign from its earliest days. Mary Stuart was Elizabeth's cousin, a Catholic with a plausible claim to the English throne, and for nearly 20 years she had been Elizabeth's prisoner. She had fled Scotland in 1568 after a series of political disasters, crossed the border into England, and thrown herself on Elizabeth's mercy. Elizabeth's response was characteristic. She did not execute Mary, because executing an anointed queen set a dangerous precedent. She did not release her, because a free Mary would become an immediate rallying point for Catholic conspiracies. Instead, she kept her. For 19 years, Mary was held in a succession of English houses and castles, comfortable enough, but never free. A permanent problem that Elizabeth refused to resolve. The problem resolved itself, or rather, it was forced to resolution in 1586, when Francis Walsingham's intelligence network uncovered the Babington plot. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman, had been corresponding with Mary, and the letters, smuggled in and out of her place of confinement in beer barrels, contained explicit discussion of a plan to assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, and place her on the throne with Spanish support. Walsingham had been intercepting and reading the letters for months, patiently allowing the conspiracy to develop until he had all the evidence he needed. When the trap closed, it closed completely. Mary was put on trial. The evidence against her was overwhelming. She was found guilty of conspiring against the life of the Queen. And then came the hardest decision Elizabeth had yet faced. You sit with her in those winter months of 1586 and 1587, and you try to understand the weight of what is being asked of her. Her Parliament wants Mary dead. Her Council wants Mary dead. Walsingham has laid out the case with his usual cold precision. Cecil, now Lord Burleigh, old and careful, advises that there is no other safe course. And Elizabeth hesitates. She hesitates for weeks, and then for months. She signs the death warrant, and then rages at her secretary William Davison for sending it. She claims she never intended the execution to be carried out so quickly. She has Davison imprisoned in the Tower.
There is a quality of genuine anguish in her behaviour during this period that is difficult to dismiss as mere performance, though performance is always part of what Elizabeth does. Mary, Queen of Scots, is executed at Fotheringay Castle on the 8th of February 1587. The accounts of her death are vivid and awful. It takes 2 blows of the axe to sever her head, and when the executioner lifts it by the hair, the auburn locks come away in his hand and the head falls to the floor, revealing the short grey hair beneath. A small dog that had been hiding under Mary's skirts emerges and lies down beside the body. These details have the quality of things people remember precisely because they are too strange and too sad to forget. Elizabeth's grief, or at least her public display of grief after Mary's execution, may have been partly strategic, a way of distancing herself from the act, of telling the courts of Europe that this was not what she wanted. But it may also have been real. Elizabeth understood better than anyone what it meant to kill a queen. She was the daughter of a queen who had been killed. The echo was inescapable. And the execution of Mary did exactly what Elizabeth's advisers had warned it might not, and what her enemies had been waiting for. It gave Philip of Spain his final justification. Mary had named Philip as her heir to the English throne, bypassing her own Protestant son James. With Mary dead, Philip could claim he was not merely avenging a martyred Catholic queen, but asserting his own legal right to the crown of England. The Armada, already in preparation, now had its moral and political framework complete. The summer of 1588 unfolds slowly, if you are living through it. The Armada is sighted off the Lizard on the 19th of July, and the English fleet puts out from Plymouth to meet it. What follows is not a single decisive battle, but a running engagement that lasts more than a week. A series of skirmishes and manoeuvres as the 2 fleets move up the Channel in an almost stately procession. The Spanish formation, that famous crescent, is disciplined and difficult to break. The English ships are faster and more heavily gunned, but they cannot close to boarding range, which is what the Spanish want, and they are burning through their ammunition at an alarming rate. The decisive moment comes at Calais, where the Armada anchors to wait for the Duke of Parma's invasion barges. On the night of the 28th of July, the English send fire ships into the anchorage. 8 vessels, packed with pitch and gunpowder and anything else that will burn, are set alight and sent drifting on the tide toward the packed Spanish fleet. The fires are visible for miles. The Spanish captains, terrified of explosion and conflagration, cut their anchor cables and scatter into the darkness. The crescent formation is broken, and it will never reform. The following day, at the Battle of Gravelines, the English fleet attacks in earnest, closing to shorter range than before and pouring shot into the dispersed Spanish ships. Several are sunk or driven ashore. The rest are forced northward, up into the North Sea, away from the rendezvous with Parma, away from any possibility of invasion. The Armada will attempt to return to Spain by sailing around the north of Scotland and down the west coast of Ireland, and the storms of the North Atlantic will destroy more ships than English guns ever did. Thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers will die of drowning, exposure, and starvation. Some who wash ashore in Ireland will be killed by local inhabitants. It is a catastrophe of enormous proportions. But at Tilbury, when Elizabeth speaks to her troops, none of this is known yet. The fireships have done their work, and the Armada has been scattered. But the full scale of the Spanish disaster has not yet become clear. For all anyone at Tilbury knows, the invasion might still come. It is this uncertainty that gives Elizabeth's presence its weight. She is not arriving after a victory to take credit. She is arriving during the crisis, when the outcome is still in doubt. And this is perhaps the thing that defines Elizabeth most clearly in this moment. She has spent her entire reign managing uncertainty. She has built a style of governance around the refusal to commit until the last possible instant, around keeping options open, around delaying and deflecting and waiting for events to clarify themselves. Her critics, both in her own time and afterward, have called this indecisiveness. Her admirers have called it wisdom. The truth is probably that it was both, depending on the circumstance. But here, at Tilbury, the delay is over. The moment has arrived, and she meets it. She stands up, she rides out, she speaks, and the words land. The defeat of the Armada does not end the war with Spain. That will grind on for another 16 years, well into the 17th century. There will be further armadas in 1596 and 1597, though none will come as close as the first. There will be English expeditions against Spanish ports and Spanish treasure fleets, some successful, many not. The conflict becomes a long, expensive, inconclusive thing, the kind of war that drains treasuries and exhausts populations without producing a clear resolution. Elizabeth will manage it the way she manages everything, with a combination of caution and calculated aggression, spending as little as possible and expecting her commanders to achieve as much as they can with what they are given. But the summer of 1588 remains the hinge. It is the moment when Elizabeth's England proves that it can withstand the greatest military power in Europe. It does not prove this through overwhelming force, because England does not have overwhelming force. It proves it through a combination of better seamanship, favourable weather, intelligent tactics, and the sheer stubbornness of a queen who has spent 30 years refusing to be dislodged from her throne. You stand in the field at Tilbury as the light begins to change, as the afternoon shadows lengthen across the trampled grass. The Queen has finished speaking. She rides slowly back along the lines, and the soldiers cheer, though the cheering has a rough, unpolished quality. Not the rehearsed acclamation of a court, but the spontaneous noise of men who are relieved and moved, and still not entirely sure they will survive the week. You watch her go, this small, upright figure on horseback, silver breastplate catching the late sun, and you think about what it has cost her to be here. Not just the journey, not just the physical risk, but the decades of calculation and compromise and watchfulness that brought her to this point. The execution she did not want to order, the war she did not want to fight, the marriage she never made, the heir she never produced, the loneliness that those choices entailed. The Armada will be defeated. England will endure. The legend of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen who defied the might of Spain, will grow and solidify and become one of the great stories of English history. But here in the field, in the warm August air, with the smell of horses and wood smoke and the sound of men settling back into the routines of camp, you are aware that the legend has not yet formed. Right now, it is just a woman in a field, surrounded by soldiers, having said what needed to be said, waiting, like everyone else, to see what happens next. The courage of that, the plain human courage of standing in uncertainty and refusing to flinch, is perhaps the most impressive thing about her. Not the speech itself, though the speech is magnificent. Not the victory, though the victory is decisive. But the willingness to be present, to be visible, to put the body where the words are, and to hold steady in the space between danger and deliverance. The sun moves lower, the camp settles. Somewhere out at sea, the remnants of the Armada are being driven north by wind and current, away from England, away from the dream of conquest that Philip spent years assembling. And here at Tilbury, the soldiers eat their evening meals and clean their weapons and talk quietly among themselves about what the Queen said and how she looked and whether the Spanish will come. The river moves past in its slow, tidal way, carrying the last light of the day out toward the estuary and the open water beyond. You have seen her at her sharpest. You have stood beside her in Kensal Chambers and on the muddy ground at Tilbury and in the cold corridors of palaces, where she paced alone after making decisions that would reshape the map of Europe. But now, the years have done what no assassin, no armada, no parliamentary petition could manage. They have begun to slow her down. And you notice it not in any single dramatic moment, but in small things. The way a candle gutters not all at once, but in a series of quiet flickers that you only recognize as a pattern when the room has already grown dimmer than you expected. It is the 1590s, and England is tired. The war with Spain did not end with the Armada's destruction. It has ground on year after year, a slow drain on the treasury and the national spirit. Fought in the Netherlands and on the coast of France, and in the grey Atlantic waters, where English privateers still hunt Spanish gold, but with diminishing returns. Ireland is a wound that will not close, rebellion smouldering in the province of Ulster under the leadership of Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, and English soldiers are dying there in bogs and ambushes, far from home, in a campaign that swallows money and men and produces nothing that resembles victory. The harvests have been poor. The late 1590s bring some of the worst weather of the century, cold, wet summers that rot the grain in the fields, and there is genuine hunger in the countryside, the kind of privation that makes people restless and resentful in ways they cannot always articulate, but that you can feel in the mood of a market square or the tone of a sermon. Elizabeth is in her 60s now, an age that is old by any measure of this era, and you can see the toll if you look carefully, though she does not make it easy to look carefully. The white makeup grows thicker, the wigs grow more elaborate, the gowns remain magnificent, stiff with jewels and embroidery, but there is a brittleness to the performance now that was not there before, a sense that the spectacle requires more effort to maintain than it once did. She still dances, Visitors to the court note this with a kind of amazement that carries, if you listen closely, just a trace of unease. She still dances galliards, the vigorous, leaping dances of her youth, and you wonder whether this is defiance or denial, or simply the habit of a woman who has always understood that to appear strong is, in the arithmetic of power, nearly the same thing as being strong. But the court around her is changing in ways she cannot fully control, and this is perhaps what unsettles her most. The men who built her reign are dying. Leicester, her sweet Robin, the man she may have loved more than any other, died in 1588, just weeks after the Armada triumph, as if the effort of that summer had consumed the last of him. She kept his final letter in a box beside her bed. When she died, it was still there, and someone found it and noticed she had written on it in her own hand, his last letter. 2 words. You think about that. You think about what it means to be a queen who cannot afford to grieve openly, who must fold even her private sorrow into a small piece of paper and tuck it away in a place only she will see. Sir Francis Walsingham, her spy master, the man who kept her alive through decades of Catholic plots, died in 1590, so deeply in debt from funding his intelligence network out of his own pocket that his family could barely afford to bury him. Sir Christopher Hatton, her Lord Chancellor, who had danced his way into her favour decades earlier and served her with genuine devotion, died in 1591. One by one, the familiar faces disappear, and you watch Elizabeth navigate this peculiar loneliness, surrounded always by hundreds of courtiers and servants and petitioners, but increasingly bereft of the people who actually knew her, who remembered the young woman she had been, who could meet her eyes with something other than calculation or fear. William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, the man who had been at her side since the very first day of her reign, who had served as her principal secretary and then Lord Treasurer for nearly 4 decades, grows old alongside her, but with less success at concealing it. He is gouty, half-crippled, carried to council meetings in a chair when he can no longer walk. Their relationship has become something almost like a marriage in its depth and its irritability. She scolds him, she worries about him, she sends him remedies for his ailments. When he finally dies in August of 1598, she withdraws into a private grief that those around her find both genuine and alarming. He was, in many ways, the last anchor to the world she understood, the world she had built. And without him, the currents of the court begin to shift in directions she finds harder to navigate. It is into this gap that Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, steps, or rather lunges, because Essex does nothing quietly. He is Leicester's stepson, young and beautiful and reckless, and Elizabeth's attachment to him is one of the most discussed and least understood relationships of her later reign. You sit in the presence chamber and watch them together, and you try to make sense of it. He flatters her extravagantly. He quarrels with her violently. He sulks when he does not get what he wants, which is often because what he wants is glory and command, and a kind of authority that Elizabeth has never willingly shared with anyone. There is something maternal in her affection for him, and something romantic, and something purely political. And the three strands are so tightly braided that you cannot separate them, and perhaps she cannot either. Essex is brave in the uncomplicated way that Elizabeth has always distrusted. He fights at Cadiz in 1596 and captures the city, and comes home expecting to be celebrated as a hero, which he is by the public. And this is precisely the problem. Elizabeth does not want heroes. She does not want anyone whose popularity might rival her own, or whose military reputation might give them an independent base of power. She has spent her entire reign ensuring that no single subject grows too large. And here is Essex, handsome and charismatic and beloved by the London crowds, growing larger by the year. The crisis comes over Ireland. The rebellion there has worsened, and in 1599, Essex is given command of the largest army England has sent to Ireland in living memory. Over 16,000 men, a force that represents an enormous investment of the Crown's dwindling resources. It is a test and an opportunity, and possibly a trap. And Essex manages to fail it in almost every conceivable way. Instead of marching north to confront Tyrone, he wanders through the southern provinces, accomplishing little. He knights dozens of his followers, a prerogative that Elizabeth has not authorized, and that she views as a direct challenge to her authority. He meets with Tyrone privately and agrees to a truce that Elizabeth has not sanctioned. And then, in September of 1599, he does something truly unforgivable. He abandons his command and rides for London without permission, bursting into Elizabeth's private chambers at Nonsuch Palace before she has had time to dress, before the wig is on and the makeup is applied. And he sees her as almost no one has seen her in decades, an old woman without her armour. You try to imagine that moment. You try to imagine what it cost her. Not the political embarrassment, which was considerable, but the personal violation. The stripping away of the image she had spent a lifetime constructing. She had always controlled who saw her, and how, and when. She had always understood that the Queen was a performance, that the white face and the red wig and the jewelled gowns were not vanity, but statecraft. And here was this reckless young man, trampling through the carefully maintained boundary between the woman and the monarch, as if it did not matter, as if she were simply a person he could barge in on, as if the performance were not the point. She does not explode at him immediately. This is perhaps the most telling detail. She receives him with apparent calm, even warmth, and only later, after she has had time to compose herself and reassemble her defences, does the real fury emerge. Essex is placed under house arrest. He is stripped of his offices. His monopoly on sweet wines, which is his primary source of income, is not renewed. He is humiliated, impoverished, and desperate. And desperate men do desperate things. On the 8th of February, 1601, Essex and a small group of followers ride into the streets of London in an attempt to raise the city against Elizabeth's government. It is not quite a rebellion against the Queen herself, or at least Essex does not frame it that way. He claims he is acting against her evil counsellors, the men who have poisoned her against him. But this is a distinction that collapses under the slightest pressure. You cannot ride armed through the streets of a monarch's capital and claim you are not challenging the monarch. The people of London, whom Essex believed loved him enough to follow him, stay inside their houses and watch from their windows and do nothing. The uprising collapses within hours. Essex is arrested, tried, and condemned. Elizabeth signs his death warrant. You have watched her agonize over death warrants before. You were there when she wrestled with the decision to execute Mary, Queen of Scots, that long, torturous deliberation that went on for months. But this is different. This is not a rival queen or a political threat wrapped in the convenient disguise of a Catholic martyr. This is someone she cared about, someone she elevated, someone whose failure feels in ways she would never articulate publicly, like her own failure. Essex is executed on the 25th of February, 1601, inside the walls of the Tower, privately, without the public spectacle that attended most noble executions. Even in this, she shows a kind of mercy, or perhaps it is simply discretion, a final management of the narrative. The crowds do not see him die. The myth of his charm and beauty is allowed to persist, uncorrected by the ugly reality of an axe. After Essex, the court grows quieter. The last years have a twilight quality that you feel in the very texture of the rooms you move through. The palaces are still magnificent. The rituals are still observed. But there is a hollowness, a sense of waiting that pervades everything. Elizabeth's godson, Sir John Harrington, visits her and later writes that she has become quite disfashioned and unutterable, that her delight is to sit in the dark and sometimes with shedding tears to bewail Essex. You do not know how much of this to trust. Harrington is a gossip and a self-dramatizer, but the image stays with you, the old queen sitting in a darkened room, and whether or not it is literally true, it captures something that was emotionally true about these final years, the sense of a woman who has outlived her own era. The question of succession hangs over everything, but is never spoken of directly. Elizabeth has refused her entire life to name an heir. She knows what it means to be the heir, the focus of every ambitious courtier's secret hopes, the living reminder that the current monarch will die. She told Parliament once that she had been the second person in the realm herself during her sister's reign, and knew the dangers of that position. She will not create a second person in her own realm. But everyone knows. Everyone has been quietly corresponding with James VI of Scotland, Mary Stuart's son, the man who will almost certainly succeed her. The letters flow north in secret. The future is being negotiated behind Elizabeth's back, and she knows this is happening, and allows it to happen, because the alternative, a disputed succession, a possible civil war, would be worse. Robert Cecil, Burghley's son, has taken his father's place as her principal secretary, and he manages the transition with the same quiet competence his father brought to everything. He is already in communication with James. The machinery of succession is being oiled and prepared even as Elizabeth continues to reign, and there is something both pragmatic and melancholy about this, the way the world begins to move on before you have actually left it. In the autumn of 1602, Elizabeth is still functioning, still receiving ambassadors, still making sharp remarks that remind everyone in the room that her mind, at least, has not dimmed. The Venetian ambassador describes her as sprightly and active despite her age. But the winter that follows is hard, and in February of 1603 she loses her closest remaining companion, the Countess of Nottingham, Catherine Howard, her cousin and long-time lady of the bedchamber, one of the last women who had been with her for decades. The grief of this loss seems to break something in her that had been holding. In March, she falls ill. She develops a fever and a soreness in her throat, and she refuses to go to bed. This detail matters. You watch her, and you understand that for this woman, to lie down is to surrender, and she has never surrendered to anything. She sits on cushions on the floor of her chamber at Richmond Palace, and she will not move. Her counsellors beg her to take to her bed. Her physicians plead with her. She ignores them. For days she sits there, propped on her cushions, sometimes silent, sometimes speaking in fragments that those around her strain to hear and will later report in various contradictory versions. Robert Cecil tells her she must go to bed. She summons enough of her old authority to reply that the word must is not used to princes, even now, even in this extremity. The language of command matters. The refusal to be managed, to be told what to do, persists when almost everything else has fallen away. You recognize this as the same quality that kept her alive in the Tower as a young woman, the same steel that allowed her to face down Parliament and play the courts of Europe against one another for 40 years. It is not stubbornness, it is something deeper. It is the absolute conviction that she is the Queen and that no one, not even death, gets to give her orders. Eventually, she does go to bed. The accounts of her final days are filtered through the memories and agendas of those who were present, and they do not all agree. Some say she named James as her successor. Some say she made a sign, raising her hand to her head in the shape of a crown when his name was spoken. Some say she said nothing at all, and that the story of her naming James was fabricated afterward to smooth the transition. You sit with the uncertainty of this. You accept that you will never know exactly what happened in that room, and this seems fitting for a woman who spent her life controlling information, and who understood better than anyone that ambiguity was a form of power. Elizabeth dies in the early hours of the 24th of March, 1603. She is 69 years old. She has reigned for 44 years. The ring that was placed on her finger at her coronation, which tradition said was her wedding ring to England, has to be filed off because her flesh has grown around it over the decades. Think about that image for a moment. The ring that cannot be removed. The bond between the Queen and the kingdom that has become so complete it is literally inseparable from her body. Within hours of her death, a rider is galloping north towards Scotland, carrying the news to James. Within days, the proclamation is read in London, and the transfer of power proceeds with a smoothness that surprises everyone. Because for decades, the great fear had been that Elizabeth's death would bring chaos, a succession crisis, perhaps even war, and instead it brings a quiet, orderly transition that is itself a testament to how well she governed. She built a country stable enough to survive its own transformation. You step back now and look at the full arc of her life. You see the child who lost her mother before she could form memories of her. You see the girl who was declared a bastard, who was interrogated
and imprisoned, who learned to survive by watching and waiting and saying precisely nothing until the moment demanded that she speak. You see the young queen who inherited a kingdom divided by religion and bankrupt by mismanagement, and who, over the course of 4.5 decades, turned it into a nation capable of challenging the great powers of Europe. You see the woman who refused to marry, not because she was afraid of love or incapable of it, but because she understood that for a queen regnant in the 16th century, marriage meant the surrender of exactly the autonomy that made her effective. You see the ruler who held power with a combination of intelligence, caution, theatricality, and an iron refusal to be rushed into decisions by anyone, no matter how urgently they pressed. What made her formidable was not any single quality, but the combination of all of them, held together across an entire lifetime under pressure that would have broken most people. She was not kind, not always. She could be cruel and petty and vain and maddeningly indecisive. She pinched pennies when generosity was needed and delayed when action was called for, and played favourites in ways that damaged good men and rewarded mediocre ones. She was human, but she was human on a scale and with a consistency that commands something more than admiration. She survived, she adapted, she endured, and she did all of this while occupying a position that every political theory of her age said she was unfit to hold. And she held it so well that by the end of her reign, the idea of a woman ruling England was no longer a scandal or an anomaly, but simply a fact, something the country had lived with so long it had become normal. Richmond Palace is quiet now. The candles are burning low. The women who attended her in her final hours move softly through the room, doing the things that must be done when a life ends. The small practical tasks that anchor grief to the physical world. Outside, the March night is cold, and the river moves past the palace walls as it has always moved, indifferent to the passage of queens. England will wake in the morning to a new monarch, a new dynasty, a new century approaching. The Elizabethan age is over, but you linger here for a moment longer. You sit in the quiet of this room where a woman has just died. A woman who was born into danger and rose to power and held it with both hands for nearly half a century. You think about what it costs to be that strong for that long. You think about the letter in the bedside box, his last letter, and the ring that had to be filed from her finger, and the cushions on the floor where she refused to lie down. You think about the girl in the tower who wrote careful letters to save her own life, and the queen at Tilbury who told her soldiers she had the heart and stomach of a king. They were the same person. That is the thing that stays with you. Across all the years and all the transformations, from the frightened girl to the painted icon, there was a single, continuous thread of will, of intelligence, of the absolute refusal to be defeated by circumstances that would have overwhelmed anyone with less steel in their spine. The room grows darker. The palace settles into silence, and somewhere a rider is moving north through the English night, carrying the news that the Queen is dead. Long live the King. The story passes on, but this part of it, Elizabeth's part, is complete, and it was, by any measure, extraordinary.